I've got to talk to you about this amazing discovery that's just taken place in ancient Jerusalem.
We came here and excavated 7 of these burial caves.
For 2,600 years, this discovery stayed buried beneath Jerusalem's stone and silence, until construction workers in Jerusalem accidentally broke through ancient rock. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. Behind that wall lay a tomb sealed for years. Inside were 2 tiny silver cylinders that nobody could open. When scientists finally cracked them decades later, what they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about the Bible. And honestly, the implications are terrifying. The accident that changed history. Let us take a journey back to Jerusalem in 1979. The city was expanding rapidly. Construction crews were digging into the rocky hillside on the western slope of the city. This area is called Ketef Hinnom, which literally translates to the shoulder of the Hinnom Valley. It sounds peaceful enough, but this valley has a dark history in biblical texts. Ancient writers described it as a place of fire and death. Some scholars believe it inspired the concept of hell itself. The valley where these workers were digging carried thousands of years of dark spiritual weight. The workers were clearing rubble when something unexpected happened. Their equipment punched through into empty space. They had accidentally breached the entrance to an underground chamber. When archaeologists arrived to investigate, they realized this was no ordinary hole in the ground. They had stumbled upon a burial complex carved directly into the limestone cliffs. And unlike virtually every other ancient tomb discovered in Jerusalem, this one had never been opened. The seal was intact. Nobody had entered this space since the day it was closed over 2,500 years ago. Think about that for a moment. Jerusalem is one of the most excavated cities on Earth. Every square meter of the old city has been dug up, fought over, rebuilt, and dug up again for thousands of years. Armies have marched through. Empires have risen and fallen. The city has been destroyed and rebuilt more times than historians can count. Finding an untouched ancient site there is almost impossible. Yet here it was, a time capsule from the first temple period, sealed and waiting for over 2.5 millennia. It was as if history itself had been holding its breath. Archaeologist Gabriel Barquet led the excavation. What he found inside would consume the next several decades of his life and reshape our understanding of ancient religious practice. The tomb contained exactly what you would expect from an elite Judean burial site. There were Iron Age pottery vessels, bronze and iron tools, stone containers, gold and silver jewelry, and scattered human bones. All of this was significant from an archaeological perspective, but none of it was extraordinary. Scholars had seen similar burial goods before at other sites throughout the region. The extraordinary discovery was hiding among the bone fragments, 2 tiny cylinders made of silver. They were incredibly small, no bigger than a cigarette filter. One measured about 4 centimeters long. The other was closer to 10 centimeters. They were so small that the excavators almost missed them entirely. In the dim light of the burial chamber, they could easily have been mistaken for fragments of jewelry or random metallic debris. It was only upon closer examination that their true nature became apparent. The objects nobody could open. When conservators examined these silver cylinders more closely, they made a startling realization. These were not solid metal objects. They were thin sheets of silver that had been carefully rolled up into tight scrolls. Someone had taken the time to engrave something on these sheets before rolling them into their cylindrical form. And these scrolls had been deliberately placed with the dead as part of the burial ritual. They were not accidental inclusions. They were intentional offerings meant to accompany the deceased into whatever came next. The silver was incredibly pure, nearly 99%. The sheets were hammered impossibly thin, just millimeters thick. Whoever made these objects was a master craftsman working at the absolute limits of ancient metallurgical technology. The scrolls showed evidence of having holes punched through their centers, suggesting they were meant to be worn on cords around the neck during life. These were amulets, personal protective charms that someone wore every day and then took with them to the grave. They represented intimate objects of faith. But here was the problem that would haunt archaeologists for years. The scrolls were so tightly wound and so incredibly fragile that any attempt to open them would destroy them completely. The silver had corroded over the centuries. The metal had become brittle and unstable. It would crack and crumble at the slightest touch. Scientists faced an impossible choice. They could leave the scrolls sealed and never know what was written inside, or they could try to open them and risk losing everything in the process. Neither option was acceptable. For years, the amulets sat in secure laboratory storage while the archaeological community debated endlessly about what to do. They tried every non-invasive technique available at the time. X-rays could not penetrate the tightly wound metal layers to reveal the inscriptions within. Early imaging technology was too primitive to read the writings without physically unrolling the sheets. The scrolls kept their secrets locked away, frustrating everyone who studied them. It seemed like the mystery might never be solved. It took 3 years of painstaking work using a combination of new photographic techniques, microscopic imaging, and incredibly careful manual unrolling before scientists could finally see what was written on those ancient sheets of silver. The process was agonizingly slow. Each millimeter of progress risked destroying centuries of preserved text. But when the work was finally complete, what researchers found made their blood run cold. The implications were staggering beyond anything they had anticipated. The divine name revealed. When the scrolls were finally unrolled and photographed line by line, archaeologists saw something remarkable. These were not random scratches or decorative patterns, as some had suspected.
These silver scrolls found in Jerusalem contain the oldest known biblical text, hundreds of years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. They preserve the ancient priestly blessing, written in delicate Hebrew script on thin silver sheets.
The silver sheets contained structured lines of text in ancient Hebrew script. Someone had carefully incised letters into the metal using a fine stylus, pressing each character into the soft silver with deliberate precision. The writing was intentional, it was coherent, and most importantly, it was readable after all those centuries. The script was Paleo-Hebrew, the alphabet used in the ancient kingdom of Judah before the Babylonian conquest. This was not the square Hebrew script that most people recognize today. It was an older, more angular form of writing that had fallen out of common use centuries before the birth of Christ. Based on the letter forms and the archaeological context of the tomb, scholars dated the amulets to the late 7th or early 6th century BCE. That places them in the final decades of the First Temple period, just before Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As scholars analyzed the inscriptions more carefully, comparing each letter to known examples from the period, they found 4 Hebrew letters that made the hair stand up on the back of their necks. YHWH, the divine name of God. The most sacred word in the entire Hebrew religious tradition was inscribed right there on those tiny pieces of silver. In Jewish tradition, this name is so sacred that it is never spoken aloud. Later scribes would develop elaborate rituals around writing it. They would use a fresh quill dipped in specially prepared ink. They would pray before forming each letter. They would purify themselves before beginning the work. Some traditions hold that a scribe who makes an error while writing the divine name must bury the entire manuscript. The name carries that much spiritual weight and demands that much reverence and respect. And here it was, inscribed on tiny personal amulets nearly 3,000 years ago. This was among the earliest physical evidence of the divine name ever discovered in a biblical context. The blessing that survived the ages. Multiple laboratories around the world worked to verify the readings. Experts in ancient Hebrew paleography compared the letter forms to other known inscriptions from the same period. Material scientists analyzed the silver composition to confirm its antiquity. Everyone wanted to make absolutely certain they were reading this correctly. The stakes were simply too high for any mistakes. And when all the analysis was complete, scholars identified the text on these scrolls. It was a version of the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. You may have heard this blessing before, even if you did not know its official name. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. These words are still recited in synagogues and churches around the world today. They have been spoken at weddings, at funerals, at baptisms, at bar mitzvahs, at every kind of religious ceremony imaginable for thousands of years. They are among the most widely known religious verses in human history, and here they were, engraved on silver sheets, buried with the dead in ancient Jerusalem, written in a form almost identical to the version preserved in the Hebrew Bible used today. The wording matched precisely, the structure matched exactly. The meaning was completely the same. A prayer that modern congregations recite every week had been inscribed on metal amulets over 2,600 years ago. The connection across time was undeniable and deeply moving. Rewriting the history of the Bible. Before this discovery, the oldest known texts of the Hebrew Bible were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those manuscripts date from roughly the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. They were considered revolutionary when they were discovered in the caves near Qumran in the 1940s and 1950s. For the first time, scholars had physical copies of biblical books that predated the medieval manuscripts by over 1,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls transformed our understanding of how the Bible was transmitted. The Ketef Hinnom amulets pushed that timeline back by another 400 years. 400 years. Let us put that in perspective. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. That is longer than the gap between Shakespeare and the present day. That is longer than the entire Protestant Reformation. These tiny silver scrolls provide a direct physical link to the biblical world that is centuries older than anything else we have ever found. Many scholars had argued that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, was largely composed during or after the Babylonian exile. Some theories suggested that priests in Babylon or later in Jerusalem essentially invented large portions of the text to serve political or religious purposes of their own time. The documents were thought to be products of their era, shaped by the needs of the community that created them, rather than preserving ancient traditions accurately. These amulets complicate that narrative significantly. If the priestly blessing was already in its canonical form before the exile, what else was already written down and standardized? If ordinary people in Jerusalem were wearing biblical verses around their necks as protective talismans decades before the city fell to the Babylonians, how widespread was biblical literacy in ancient Judah? How established was the religious tradition that we thought developed much later? The scrolls do not prove that Moses wrote the entire Torah on Mount Sinai exactly as tradition claims. That is not how archaeology works. But they do demonstrate convincingly that key elements of the biblical tradition were already ancient when the first temple was destroyed. They were not new compositions invented by exiles trying to preserve their identity in a foreign land. They were sacred formulas already deeply embedded in everyday religious practice for generations. The timing of these amulets makes them even more remarkable and poignant. They were buried in the final decades before one of the greatest catastrophes in Jewish history. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem.
The First Temple period begins when Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, and it's destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, which brings the First Temple period to an end.
His massive armies surrounded the city and cut off all supplies. After months of starvation and suffering, his forces broke through the walls. They burned the temple to the ground, demolished the city fortifications, and carried the surviving population into exile far from their homeland. The world that created these scrolls was completely destroyed. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. The temple where priests recited this very blessing was reduced to rubble and ash. The craftsmen who made these amulets, the priests who blessed them, the people who wore them, all were killed or scattered to the winds of exile. Everything familiar was swept away in a tide of conquest and destruction. Yet the words survived. The blessing inscribed on those tiny sheets of silver.
It was cylindrical, about an inch in size, about half an inch in diameter, and it was very clear it is made of silver. It was some kind of a tiny scroll.
Outlasted the kingdom that produced it. It outlasted the exile in Babylon. It outlasted the return to Jerusalem decades later. It outlasted the Second Temple and its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. It outlasted 2,000 years of Jewish diaspora, persecution, and wandering. And when archaeologists finally cracked open those ancient scrolls in the 20th century, the words were still there, still recognizable, still carrying the same power they had millennia ago. One of the most fascinating aspects of this discovery is how it required the convergence of ancient mystery and modern technology. When technology meets antiquity. Without advances in conservation, science developed in the late 20th century, these scrolls would still be sealed shut today. Without precision photography and microscopic imaging techniques, the inscriptions would remain forever unreadable. Without interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, material scientists, chemists, and textual scholars, the full significance of the find might never have been understood. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls sat in storage for years precisely because the technology to study them properly did not exist yet. Sometimes, archaeological discoveries have to wait for science to catch up with the questions they pose. The scrolls were patient. They had already waited 2,600 years in the darkness of that tomb. What was a few more decades in a climate-controlled laboratory? This raises an interesting question that should give us all pause. How many other artifacts are sitting in museum basements right now, waiting for future technology to unlock their secrets? How many sealed containers, illegible inscriptions, and mysterious objects will yield their mysteries only when we develop tools that do not exist yet? The Ketef Hinnom scrolls remind us that archaeological discovery is not just about digging things up. It is about seeing what has been invisible and understanding what seemed incomprehensible. We promised you that this discovery is terrifying. Let us explain what we mean by that. The terror is not supernatural. Nobody is claiming that these scrolls contain curses or dark magic or ancient evil. The terror is something more profound and harder to articulate. It is the terror of realizing that some things persist far beyond their time. That words can outlive the people who wrote them, the civilization that produced them, and the entire world that gave them meaning. These amulets were never meant to be found by us. They were buried with the dead as personal protections for the journey into the afterlife. The people who wore them expected to wear them forever, accompanying them into whatever existence awaited beyond death. And in a sense, they did exactly that. The amulets stayed with their owners for 2,600 years until construction workers accidentally disturbed their eternal rest. We have peered into a moment of ancient religious practice that was supposed to remain private for eternity. There is also something unsettling about how much we still do not know despite this discovery. These scrolls survived by pure accident. Most similar objects from the period did not make it through the centuries. They corroded. They were looted. They were destroyed in the various catastrophes that befell Jerusalem. How many other biblical texts were circulating in ancient Judah that we will never see? How many variations of familiar stories were told and lost forever? The Ketef Hinnom scrolls are like catching a single frame of a film that has been otherwise completely destroyed. We know there is a bigger picture out there, but we can only glimpse one tiny fragment of it. The text may be far older and far more fixed than generations of scholars ever imagined possible. The scrolls that changed everything. Today, the Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls are among the most important artifacts in biblical archaeology. They provide a fixed, datable reference point for understanding the transmission of the Hebrew Bible across the centuries. They prove conclusively that the priestly blessing existed in essentially its modern form before the Babylonian destruction. They push back our knowledge of Hebrew religious practice and biblical literacy by centuries. But beyond their scholarly significance, there is something deeply moving about these objects on a human level. They were personal. They were intimate. Someone in ancient Jerusalem believed with all their heart that these words, inscribed on silver and worn close to the heart every single day, could provide protection and blessing. Someone paid for them, wore them, and was buried with them. And nearly 3,000 years later, we can still read their prayer. We can still feel their faith reaching across the ages. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. These words crossed the gulf of millennia. They survived conquest and exile and the rise and fall of empires. They emerged from a tomb that was never meant to be opened, inscribed on scrolls that seemed impossible to read. And they turned out to be words that billions of people still recognize and cherish today. That is the real mystery of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. Not what they contain, but that they survived at all. And that survival might be the most terrifying and wonderful thing about them. It reminds us that some words are meant to endure forever. What are your thoughts on this terrifying discovery? Share your thoughts in the comments.